Little Black Lies. Corporate and Political Spin in the Global War for Oil by Jeff Gailus. Among the calamities of war may be jointly numbered the diminution of the love of truth by the falsehoods which interest dictates and credulity encourages. Quote by Samuel Johnson, The Idler Magazine, November 11th, 1758. So let us not talk falsely now. The hour is getting late. Bob Dylan, All Along the Watchtower. Little Black Lie. Noun. 1. A subtle manipulation of fact that may appear to be true, but is in reality false and or misleading, often used to justify or oppose the development of Canada's tar sands. B. The subconscious lies we tell ourselves about the world we live in, often used to justify positions not supported by facts. Chapter 1. What's in a name? Even though it is the demise of earthly forests that elicits our concern, we must bear in mind that as culture dwellers, we do not live so much in forests of trees as in forests of words. Neil Evernden, from The Natural Alien. It is difficult even to know how to begin. The rhetoric in the battle over the future of Alberta's bitumen treasure has become so loaded, the arguments for and against so mendacious and untrustworthy, the language so contested that it is hard even to know what to call the thing about which I have chosen to write. No matter what I call it, I will enrage or fail someone. If I use tar sands, I will be dismissed as an environmental radical by industrialists, conservative politicians, and much of Canada's mainstream media. If I choose oil sands, some will brand me an unthinking apologist, a propagandist, for the oil industry and its political servants. But perhaps what we choose to call it is less important than how we talk about it and what we should do with it. Whether we call it oil sands or tar sands, it's fair to say that the extraction of Alberta's bitumen has become the most controversial energy development in the world, and for good reason. I have seen firsthand the pyramids at Giza and many of the world's largest dams, and they all pale in comparison to what is envisioned for northern Alberta. Alberta's bitumen deposits contain 169 billion barrels of recoverable oil, the lion's share of the 174 billion barrels that make Canada the third largest deposit of petroleum on the planet after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Approximately 140,000 square kilometers, 20% of Alberta's land base, an area larger than most of the world's countries, is scheduled to be mowed down and dug up over the next century. This buried treasure is worth trillions of dollars at today's oil prices, a prospect that has encouraged companies from all over the world, Abu Dhabi, China, France, Norway, Japan, and South Korea, to invest in this granddaddy of all oil plays. At the moment, these corporate giants turn Alberta's bitumen into some 1.7 million barrels of bitumen crude every day, more than half of Canada's total crude oil production, and they are only just warming up. Projects approved to date, dozens of them, could increase production to as much as 4 million barrels per day, the approximate equivalent of 1/3 of Saudi Arabia's daily production, and nearly twice as much as Venezuela's. Industry forecasts indicate that by 2025, if everything goes according to plan, oil companies will be delivering 4.2 million barrels or more of bitumen crude per day, almost all of it destined to feed the insatiable appetites of the United States, and soon India and China. When American oil magnate J. Howard Pugh opened the first bitumen mine in northern Alberta in 1967, he was destined to become either a genius or a fool. Pugh was the president of Sun Oil and the United States' seventh richest man. Turning bitumen into oil in the late 1960s was an unprofitable experiment that Canadian governments wanted little to do with. But Pugh forged ahead anyway. A prescient entrepreneur, Pugh believed easy-to-access light crude would become harder and harder to find. Although Alberta's bitumen deposits were difficult and expensive to extract, he reasoned that they had the potential to provide the United States with an abundant source of oil far into the future. And so he invested $250 million in Sun Oil's bitumen mine, and lost money for years. But he knew, or at least hoped, that bitumen's time would come. He need only to toil and wait. For 35 years, the oil sands industries, engineers, and accountants worked in relative obscurity, but such an enormous undertaking could not stay hidden for long. As other companies took up the challenge, and the mines expanded, and the tailings ponds spread, a growing chorus of critics began raising the alarm about the potential risks inherent in a precipitous development that seemed to be spiraling out of control. Biologists began lamenting the continued decline of the threatened caribou populations more than a decade ago. In 2006, a medical doctor and his patients wondered aloud about the excessive rate of rare and lethal cancers in Fort Chipewyan, a small First Nations community downstream. 4 years later, ecologists decried the deaths of 1,600 ducks in the toxic waters of a tailings pond. Environmentalists criticized the project's impact on local watersheds and the global climate, as well as the impacts of new and expanded pipelines needed to move bitumen crude to market. As development exploded and reclamation fell further and further behind, critics realized they would need to dig in and fight what has turned out to be a protracted war that has expanded all over the world. The battle lines are clearly drawn. On one side is a powerful collaboration between some of the world's largest corporations and the governments of Alberta and Canada, which have aligned themselves together in what can only be described as a modern-day triple alliance. These captains of industry and government maintain, with the certainty of a host of evangelical preachers, that they are developing Alberta's enormous bitumen deposits responsibly, sustainably, and without undue environmental harm. In the same breath, they routinely downplay the environmental risks and accentuate the putative societal benefits, mostly profits and jobs, while proclaiming their steadfast belief that our economy and security, our very way of life here in North America, depends on the rapid liquidation of Alberta's bitumen. On the other side of the battlefield is a loose coalition of individuals and organizations, activists, environmentalists, First Nations, and a few vocal scientists, arrayed against the Triple Alliance's superior firepower. Big and small, ad hoc and professional, these guerrilla-style fighters differ in their motivations and goals. Some want tar sands development to stop immediately, while others simply want it managed in the responsible, sustainable manner the Triple Alliance has promised. Routinely pilloried in the mainstream press for being extremist chicken littles, all are worried that the current state of affairs is untenable. That in this, the age of climate change, extracting and processing bitumen and combusting its end products in our vehicles is at least as risky as endless proliferation of nuclear weapons. Although the war is ultimately about oil, the substance in question is actually bituminous sand, a mixture of sand, clay, water, and an extremely viscous form of petroleum called bitumen, which itself contains a noxious combination of sulfur, nitrogen, salts, carcinogens, heavy metals, and other toxins. A handful of bituminous sand is the hydrocarbon equivalent of a snowball. Each grain of sand is covered by a thin layer of water. all of which is enveloped in the very viscous tar-like bitumen. In its natural state, the stuff has the consistency of a hockey puck. The Triple Alliance prefers the term oil sands, while most opponents use the dirtier-sounding tar sands. Technically, both terms are inaccurate, but corporate and government generals and the soldiers who do their bidding are rarely concerned with accuracy as they build the vocabulary of metaphors that guide our lives. Language has become both tool and weapon, and with hundreds of billions of dollars in profits and government revenues at stake, the linguistic and ethical gloves have come off in what historians may one day refer to as the Great Bitumen War. The editorial board of the New York Times must have had all this in mind when they decided to use tar sands in an April 2, 2011 editorial condemning TransCanada Corporation's Keystone XL pipeline as unnecessary and environmentally risky. The $7 billion Keystone XL, which would ferry bitumen from Alberta to heavy oil refineries in the Gulf Coast of Texas, had become a lightning rod of controversy in the United States. The editors at the Times must have considered the matter carefully before choosing what they knew would be a contentious headline that included the T word. The Times' diction may have emboldened U.S. President Barack Obama to decide only 4 days later to use tar in his first ever reference to Alberta's bitumen deposits, at a town hall meeting on energy in Pennsylvania. "These tar sands," he said, "there are some environmental questions about how destructive they are, potentially. What are the dangers there? And we've got to examine all those questions." He too chose the T word purposefully, perhaps to win points with the environmentalists he has so often disappointed since he moved into the White House in 2009. If so, it worked. Environmentalists quietly celebrated the president's controversial diction as a small victory against the interminable roar of the oil industry's propaganda machine. Canada's conservative politicians and mainstream media outlets, meanwhile, responded with outrage, usually reserved for political scandals and terrorist attacks. The editorial board of the Calgary Herald, the leading daily newspaper in what has become the capital city of Canada's oil industry, referred to the term as an inaccurate description favoured by anti-oil lobbyists. The National Post's Peter Foster, a fierce and vitriolic defender of the oil industry, said, "The Times' hatchet job editorial read as if dictated by the pipeline's radical environmentalist opponents," and dismissed it as just another example of hysterical environmentalism. Alberta Premier Ed Stelmach was more tactful. He simply wrote a letter to the Times and, staying right on message, voiced his concern over the erroneous information used to describe the Alberta oil sands. Apart from a letter in the Times from the President and CEO of TransCanada Corp., Big Oil remained mostly silent, content to let politicians and the mainstream media excoriate those who would oppose its black prize. Given the reaction to the use of tar sands by President Obama and the New York Times, you might be forgiven for believing that the term has been foisted upon us by nasty, truth-hating environmentalists. But you'd be wrong. The term has actually been part of the oil industry's lexicon for decades, used by geologists and engineers since at least 1939. According to Alberta oil historian David Finch, everyone called them tar sands until the 1960s, and both terms were used interchangeably until about 10 years ago, when the terminology became politicized. With the notable exception of the Pembina Institute, an Alberta-based environmental think tank that often collaborates with government and industry staff, critics of the way Alberta's bitumen deposits are being developed use tar sands because that is what the resource was called when they entered the debate. The term accentuates the obvious downsides of the endeavor, water pollution, for instance, and the decline of certain wildlife species, not to mention considerable greenhouse gas emissions and the infringement of First Nations constitutionally protected treaty rights. but it is hardly something environmentalists concocted out of nowhere to give the contested development a bad name. Even the Alberta Chamber of Resources, an industry lobby group, admits that the term oil sands gained popularity in the mid-1990s when government and industry began an aggressive public relations campaign to improve public perception of the dirty-sounding tar sands. Oil sands, you see, conveys a certain usefulness, a natural resource that creates jobs, increases government revenues, enhances energy security, and makes investors rich beyond measure. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Products, CAPP, the oil industry's most powerful lobby organization, went so far as to compare the consistency of oil sands mine tailings to yogurt and that of heavy oil to peanut butter. Compared to tar, oil sounds clean and relatively easy to pump out of the ground, like its distant cousin, light crude. Tar, on the other hand, is dark and heavy, the kind of glop better suited to paving roads or coating dangerous subversives before feathering them and banishing them from society altogether. If this seems like meaningless meditation on semantics, consider the tragic story of a mislabeled fish. The so-called Chilean sea bass, Disocychus eleganoides, as it is commonly known in the U.S., is a pelagic fish that is only partly Chilean and not at all bass. Originally called the Patagonian toothfish, it is actually a member of the family of Notothenidae, the cod ice fishes, which lurks in the depths of the ocean surrounding Antarctica. Bass, by comparison, are generally thought of as popular freshwater game fish, though there are a few saltwater species. None are remotely related to Disocychus eleganoides, which is a bug-eyed, big-lipped relic of the ages that is almost identical to the sablefish, or black cod, of the North Pacific. The Patagonian toothfish has been called the perfect fish, because it produces generous fillets of white, mild-flavored meat, with a firm texture that is almost impossible to overcook. Despite this gastronomical upside, initial efforts to market this now popular staple fell flat. For some reason, Patagonian toothfish proved unappealing to consumers and the advertisers who tried to satisfy their appetites. Until 15 years ago, no one could be convinced to buy it. That all changed when the Patagonian toothfish became the Chilean sea bass. A creative marketing campaign launched by California fish salesman Lee Lance changed public perception almost overnight, and the new, if scientifically inaccurate, label turned the Chilean sea bass into the darling of our finest high-end restaurants. It is so popular, in fact, that growing demand has sent the Patagonian toothfish population spiraling into the depths. Bruce Neck, who wrote an entire book on the fish's plight, describes how commercial overfishing and widespread fish piracy of this slow-reproducing cod have depleted the fishery, raising concerns that our desire for its perfect flesh will one day drive it to extinction. It used to be that more fish were caught in some nearby body of water. Now they're coming from the bottom of the earth, Neck told Tom Brokaw in an interview on NBC. As long as people want the fish on their table and there's money to be made, fishermen will deliver. Netting Patagonian toothfish and digging up Alberta's tar sands have much in common. Both are in demand and very controversial. And both have become the focus of well-run public relations campaigns that will make the difference between market success and unprofitable failure. The Canadian media's attack on the New York Times tar sands editorial indicates just how successful the Triple Alliance has been in its efforts to win the public relations war in the battle for the oil sands. Just check the headlines in any daily newspaper where the media prefers the term oil sands, and in the process helps the Triple Alliance promote its interests and brand its opponents as extremists and heretics. The Calgary Herald's Paula Arab claimed the word tar sands is inaccurate and pejorative. It has become part of the rhetoric of extremists who are anti-oil and who want to shut down the industry, a term that aborts the debate before it gets started. She went on to say, pointing a finger at Obama, that Canada has to engage the world in an informed discussion about the oil sands, adding that it would help if politicians used the language correctly. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation actually has a language policy that mandates the use of oil sands, claiming it is more neutral and more accurate because the substance eventually refined from the extracted bitumen is oil. But award-winning book Tar Sands, Dirty Oil and the Future of a Continent. If this was really how we named things, then we'd call tomatoes ketchup and trees lumber. Gold would be fine, of course, for it is a native metal found largely in its pure metallic form, but we would need to start calling wheat flour and cows beef. The reality is that the mainstream media uses oil sands because the Triple Alliance has made the T word too controversial, and Big Oil spends a lot of money on advertising. As any corporate communications consultant worth her $1,000 a day rate knows, there is nothing intrinsically correct, neutral, or accurate about the term oil sands, nor is it a coincidence that media coverage has favored rich and powerful business interests. The media's preference for oil sands is simply the result of the Triple Alliance's crafty political spin and an aggressive, well-funded strategy to brand bitumen development in the brightest possible light, part of a much grander battle plan that relies on a dark web of little black lies to win the day.